When I was a little kid, my Gramps used to terrify me with tales about the night floaters. The night floaters, malignant beings able to detach their heads from the trunks of their bodies. These heads could then float or fly through the night to spy upon and even attack unsuspecting or sleeping victims, sometimes biting them, sometimes even killing them. And if that wasn't bad enough, they could also animate their headless bodies to pursue and strangle innocent people. They made a strange moaning sound when far away, which faded as they got closer to you. Gramps wasn't sure if they were cryptids or members of a cult or a coven, like a coven of witches. He did say they had to go into a trance state in order to detach their heads from their bodies, a trance state in which they were vulnerable to attack. The night floaters were sometimes called floaters for short, or bobs. Bobs, as the motion of their heads floating through the darkness, and they were mainly active at night, was similar to that of a buoy bobbing on the surface of a body of water. They drove old black cars and tended to congregate at an old abandoned silo out by the fourth line. I once asked Gramps if he had ever seen a night floater. He hesitated before he said, "I only saw one once. At least, I think I saw one." "Where?" I started to say, but he cut me off. "It was a night in fall, September or October. I was just a young kid, still in grade school. For some reason, I was restless and couldn't sleep, so I got up and went to look out my bedroom window. I only saw it for a second. There was this used car dealership near the house with bright lights lit up all day and all night. And in the glare of those lights, I saw it. I saw a human head with its hair trailing out behind it, illuminated by all the lights and flying through the air about 50 feet off the ground. I got back into bed in a hurry. Then, when I was about 18 or 19, we heard a rumor that there were all kinds of wild parties connected with the night floaters, and that they hung out at this old abandoned farm silo out by the fourth line. So naturally, we had to check it out. The silo itself stood there in the moonlight, a sentinel of leprous, weathered concrete, standing amongst the ruins of a barn in the middle of a field fringed with thick trees and only a few hundred yards from the Queen Elizabeth Highway. Around the base stood a number of black vehicles, a huge jacked-up Ford 150 pickup truck, a 1950s Buick, some said a 51, and a long stretched-out station wagon type car, which just had to have been a hearse. It was old, too, from the 1940s. Some of the guys wanted to take a closer look, but I remembered the night floaters were partial to old black cars, so we got the hell out of there. And that was it. I remembered thinking, that's all? But I didn't say anything. He was my Gramps, and after all, I didn't want to hurt his feelings. Sadly, Gramps passed away 2 years ago, so I can no longer ask him any more questions about the night floaters. But before he died, we stumbled across a YouTube channel. A YouTube channel run by a guy Gramps said he had gone to high school with. A guy he described as a real weirdo who was convinced the night floaters were real. Still, I kept watching the channel. a warning to the curious, and eventually I decided to go and find out for myself whether the night floaters were real. And I'd start by looking for the old silo itself, rendezvous of the night floaters. I was pretty sure it was no longer there. I had driven past the area many times, and while there were thick strands of trees there, I'd never seen a sign of any silo. Still, I hadn't looked really hard. So I set out late one gloomy November afternoon, but when I reached the fourth line, a fog or mist, perhaps caused by the sudden arrival of cold damp air, a fog or mist began crawling across the road, totally obscuring my vision. I pulled off onto a dirt trail running north of the nearby tracks and stopped the car, watching the mist swirling outside my windows. I was glad to get off the road, as the fog had created a potentially dangerous situation. But was I any better off now? I seem to remember Gramps mentioning a dirt road in his story about his nocturnal visit to the old silo, so I decided to push on. Besides, if someone else pulled off onto the trail, they would rear-end me. I drove slowly forward, but the fog actually seemed to increase. The white cotton batten swirling around me seemed to deaden all sound, and all I could hear was my own labored breathing. I had to inch forward, always worried I might leave the trail or encounter some obstruction. And then suddenly the mist was gone. The veil was swept aside, and I found myself at the silo and the ruins of the old barn. And there were cars there. Black cars. A huge, jacked-up Ford 150 pickup truck, a 1950s Buick, and a long, stretched-out station wagon-type car, which just had to be the hearse from the 1940s. It was just like Gramps said. I got out of my car. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do or not. But I wanted to actually see if those cars were real. I wanted to touch them. One of the first things that struck me was the silence. The silence. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Now I know fog can muffle sound, but we were only a few hundred yards from the Queen Elizabeth, one of the busiest highways in North America. But I could hear no sound of traffic, no nothing, just my own breathing. Wait, what was that? I seemed to hear a faint moaning sound. Weird. I figured it must be the wind in the nearby trees. Maybe it would blow all the fog away. I hope so. I listened hard, but it quickly faded away to nothing. I walked over to the nearest vehicle, the hearse, and ran my hand along the cold, black side. I then walked around to the front to see what kind of vehicle it was, and it was a Packard, a legendary Packard. I don't think I'd ever seen a Packard before. I checked out the others, which turned out to be a jacked-up Ford pickup truck, and the old Buick with the distinctive front grille. But where were all the people? Where were all the people? I tiptoed over to the foundation of the old barn. For some reason, I felt but didn't wholly understand. I was trying to be as quiet as possible. Now, the remains of the foundation had a concrete roof, probably the floor of the now missing barn. At one end of the foundation was a dark opening where a pair of double doors would have led to a basement storage area. I stuck my head in and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. and reeled back in shock. The dirt floor of the storage space was covered in bodies, bodies in various stages of undress, but all barefoot. They were laid out like corpses, like the dead, but that wasn't the worst of it. They were headless. Headless. They had all been decapitated. Where their heads should have been, there was a gaping maw. I backed out of there in panic. I wasn't thinking night floaters. I was thinking mass murder and thinking I had to get the hell out of Dodge. I determined to drive out, to go to the police. But now the fog was back, thicker and heavier than before. How was I going to be able to find the trail again in all this murk? And that's when the heads, the night floaters, came flying out of the mist. There were 3 or 4 of them. I didn't have time to count as they swooped down on me, and I didn't get a good look at them either. But their faces were thin, dirty, and disheveled, with eyes that arrested me, eyes that were red and glowing. They were trying to bite me. Seriously. At least they kept snapping their teeth at me. So I did the only thing I could do. I jumped into the car. I jumped into the car and locked the doors. Not that it stopped the heads from leering at me. They shrieked the vilest obscenities. And then kissed. Yeah, kissed. And then licked my windshield. But just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the bodies, the headless bodies, came lurching out of the fog. I then remembered what Gramps had told me. The night floaters could also animate their headless bodies to pursue and strangle innocent people. The headless zombies now tried to open my doors and when that failed, began to pound and then rock the vehicle. So in the end, I had no alternative but to turn the key in the ignition and hit the gas. I went bumping across the field, unable to see past the hood of the car, until finally I came up against a thick strand of trees and had to stop. I immediately killed the ignition, hoping against hope that I had lost the floaters in the obscurity. I sat there, cold and waiting for them to find me. Eventually I fell into a troubled sleep, where I saw Gramps. Gramps smiled at me and gently shook his head. And then he was gone. Gone. And I woke up. I woke up to the light of early morning. The fog was gone, and as I looked about me, so was everything else. The silo, the ruins of the foundations, the black vehicles, the night floaters. There was nothing. Just an abandoned farmer's field. An abandoned farmer's field covered with tall grass. I slowly bumped my way across the field, found the old rutted trail again, and drove home. But what had just happened to me? Was it just a hallucination? Was it a paranormal experience? Had the night floaters, their black cars, the silo, all rolled in with the creeping fog? Were they really there? You tell me. The only thing I know is that I'm sorry I ever doubted Gramps. I now know the night floaters are real. The night floaters are real. And I hope you know it too. The moral of the story? You should never doubt Gramps, lest he turn into Grumps. If this is your first visit to my channel, please consider subscribing. My name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring such cryptids as the night floaters, werewolves, and the black-eyed children. So again, please consider subscribing. Please help me to reach my goal of 2,500 subs in 2022. Till midnight. Cheers. Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pix here. That's PX here. While the music was the wonderful Ghost Processional by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod. Thank you for listening.